Thank you, Madam Speaker. China is trying to silence the truth abroad after having silenced it at home. Several months ago, I woke up to the news that China's government had sanctioned me, adding me to a list of officials in the United States, in Europe, and the United Kingdom who have been sanctioned simply for speaking against Beijing's genocide of its Uyghur Muslim minority, speaking against the crackdown in Hong Kong. The sanctions ban me and others who have been sanctioned from visiting China and prohibits Chinese citizens and institutions from doing business with me. Having no plans to travel to China and having no business ties there, they will have no effect on me. Nevertheless, they should be taken seriously as an attempt to silence the growing criticism of the Chinese government's human rights record and its violations of international law. Since President Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, the Chinese government has become increasingly assertive in shutting down criticism. Increasing threats have accompanied this increasing assertiveness. Les actions de la Chine sont une menace au Canada.
China's actions are a threat in Canada.
Spaver have now been detained for over 2 years. Robert Schellenberg has been put on death row. The fates and whereabouts of Hussein Jalil is unknown. The Chinese government has arbitrarily banned the imports of products that target Canadian farmers. And Canada is not the only target of China's regime. From its growing intimidation of Taiwan to its recent border skirmishes with India and the unilateral extension of its boundaries into the South China Sea, the Chinese Communist Party is increasingly threatening its neighbors. And it is not only abroad where the Chinese government is challenging the rules-based international order. In its crackdown on Hong Kong, it is violating the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 that guaranteed Hong Kong's autonomy for 50 years from 1997. In its mass detention and sterilization of the Uyghur Muslim minorities, it is violating the 1948 Genocide Convention, the very first international human rights treaty adopted at the United Nations. The abuse of other minorities continues with its treatment of Tibetans, practitioners of Falun Gong, and Christians. We must wake up to the reality in liberal democracies that in recent years, instead of improving their record on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, authoritarian governments have used their newfound prosperity to reinforce that authoritarianism. Here in Canada, CSIS has warned that state-sponsored espionage through 5G technologies and biotechnology threatens our national security and intellectual property regime. The government should advise Canadian universities against partnerships with Huawei, and it should issue a directive to the federal granting councils banning such partnerships. It's time that Canada joins our Five Eyes allies in banning Huawei from participating in our 5G telecommunications network. In 2016, this government joined the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and so far has contributed $50 million of public money to that bank and is asking for another $49 million to contribute to that bank through the estimates. It's part of China's strategy to export its model of authoritarian governance throughout the Indo-Pacific region. It's why President Obama and Vice President Biden at the time, in 2016, asked the Canadian government not to join. Canada should suspend payments to the bank and withdraw. The Chinese government is intimidating Canadians here at home, particularly those in the Chinese community. Hong Kong pro-democracy activists and students on university campuses across the nation have been subject to threats. A robust plan is needed from this government to counter these intimidation operations, increase enforcement, and make it clear to China's diplomats accredited here in Canada, some several hundred of them, that any role in these intimidation operations here on Canadian soil is grounds to be declared persona non grata and expelled from this country. In China, there is evidence that Uyghurs in Xinjiang province are being forced to pick cotton and produce tomatoes through a coercive state-run system. the government needs to introduce new effective measures to ban the importation of products from China that have been produced using forced labor. These gross violations of human rights and international law in the treatment of the Uyghur people, in the treatment of the people of Hong Kong, cannot go unanswered. If we do not work with our democratic allies to counter these violations, we will allow the Chinese Communist Party to export its model of authoritarianism and undermine the rules-based international order that has provided relative peace and security since 1945. Madame la Présidente, the sanctions imposed on me and others have brought us together. They have backfired. I've met with elected parliamentarians who have been sanctioned in the United Kingdom, the European Union, and members of national parliaments throughout Europe. The sanctions have brought us together and have brought us together in action. We are working more closely together now, because of these sanctions, to counter China's threats to liberal democracies. For example, recently, a European delegation meeting chaired by a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Reinhard Bütikofer, invited me and a dozen and a half members of the European Parliament, as well as members of national parliaments in the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Lithuania, and here in Canada, to talk about countering China's threats. We had a productive meeting, albeit, Madame la Présidente, it being European time, it was at 4 o'clock in the morning. But nevertheless, with copious amounts of coffee, we had a productive meeting and endeavored to work together. Out of these discussions has come action. On May 20th, the European Parliament overwhelmingly passed a motion freezing ratification of the European Union-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, a treaty concluded on December 30th of last year, and a treaty that is a signature effort of President Xi Jinping of China. Just several weeks ago, Australia canceled 2 Belt and Road initiatives of China because of China's threats to Australia. Madame la Présidente, that is the kind of action this House and this government should be taking in response to these sanctions and to the threats that China is posing to our citizens, our economy, and our values. Madam Speaker, the sanctions imposed on me and others are a clumsy effort by the People's Republic of China to silence the free speech and open debate at the heart of liberal democracies. They will work if we are silent. We cannot be silent. We cannot let the hard-won and hard-fought-for ideals that underpin our democracies, a belief in liberty and freedom, a belief in human rights, a belief in democratic institutions, and a belief in the rule of law. For if we are silent, we will let these hard-won and cherished beliefs be lost to a new ascendant model of authoritarianism, repression, and fear. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Calgary-Workridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his speech. And the member for Wellington-Halton Hills is modest and won't say it perhaps, so I will, that he is truly a champion of freedom and Canadian ideals of the rule of law, democracy, and pluralism. It is curious that the Chinese government singled out a member of the opposition as worthy of sanction for opposing the regime's authoritarianism, and rather than a member of this government. And I wonder if the member for Wellington-Halton Hills can comment further on the need for this government to do better in support of the Michaels who remain in prison, and to stand up for Canadian values.
Member for Wellington-Halton Hills.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for that question, for his work on this important issue. I think these sanctions are an opportunity for liberal democracies to work more closely together, for their governments to work more closely together, for their elected legislatures to work more closely together to counter these threats. I think the European Union Parliament's decision to freeze the investment treaty with China several weeks ago, I think the Australian government's decision several weeks ago to cancel 2 Belt and Road agreements with China are indicative of this. And I would encourage the government to use these sanctions as an opportunity to suspend payments to the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and to withdraw Canada as a member from that bank.
Commentaires, questions or comments? The Honourable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Once again, I'd like to thank my colleague for Wellington-Halton Hills for his efforts and for his commitment on this file. I also want to highlight the fact that his motion was voted on, and he accepted an amendment from the Bloc Québécois. He accepted it willingly. There's been a statement from the subcommittee in October saying that there was a genocide in Xinjiang. There was an open letter signed by all members and parties of this House requesting that the Olympics be relocated, a motion that was passed in the House of Commons along those same lines, indicating that there's a genocide happening in Xinjiang. Can my colleague tell me why the Prime Minister refuses to say that a genocide is happening over there? Thank you.
For Wellington-Halton Hills.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like first to thank my colleague for his work on this very important issue. In my opinion, there's other action that the Canadian government could take to fight this threat from China. And this issue concerns genocide against Uyghurs. And this action with respect to the Olympics and Special Olympics in Beijing, the Winter Olympics. And the Canadian government, it's up to them to say now, publicly, that it will make a decision to not send a government official to the Olympics and Special Olympics, to send a message to China that it's absolutely unacceptable what's happening against the Uyghurs of China.
Member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for Wellington-Halton Hills for his commitment on human rights. And I think this is an important debate that has been started today. What concerns me, Madam Speaker, frankly, is the reaction from the government. We heard from the member from Winnipeg North just a few minutes ago, seemed irritated about the discussion around human rights. We've certainly seen this with this government when we raise issues, for example, the export of Canadian military goods to Saudi Arabia and human rights violations there. The government seems perturbed, seems angered when human rights are issues that are front and center in the House of Commons. So I wanted to ask my colleague from Wellington-Halton Hills, why does the government react this way on fundamental issues of human rights?
The Honourable Member for Wellington-Halton Hills.
Well, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from the NDP for that question. I think in answer to the question, I think there's a pattern with this government, and that is a big gap between its rhetoric on issues like democracy, the rule of law and human rights, and reality. This government came to office promising to make Canada a leader, for example, on foreign aid around the world. And the fact is that foreign aid has been cut by 10% relative to the average under the previous government. The government promised to do better on climate change, yet emissions have risen each and every year that this government has been in power, including for the most recent year for which data is available, which is the year 2019. And so too on human rights. The government has said it would do a better job on human rights, but its actions and its record says otherwise.